Our second scripture reading continues where the first left off with Luke chapter 4, verses 22 through 30. All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, "Is not this Joseph's son?" He said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here in your hometown the things that we have heard you did at Capernaum.' And he said, 'Truly, I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over all the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them except to a widow at Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many lepers in Israel at the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian." When they heard this, all the synagogue was filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Things are going so well. The people at the synagogue in Nazareth are amazed and astonished by Jesus' gracious words. They're saying great things about him. Did you hear what he said? What a good public speaker. A one-line sermon? No, I could get used to that. I hardly can believe he's Joseph's boy, all grown up. I always knew there was something special about him. How tempting it must have been for Jesus to end things right there, to soak in the praise and relish that moment, that high public approval. It's early on in his ministry, and he's recently returned from his time in the wilderness, where he resisted that first round of temptations. Luke tells us that the devil departed from him until a more opportune time. Well, just 3 verses later, a more opportune time has quickly come here in Nazareth. Dr. Jonathan Walton, a professor of Christian morals at Harvard, wonders if this moment in Nazareth might be when Jesus' real temptation began. Maybe it was easier in the desert, easier to stay true to his mission when he had such an obvious opponent as the devil. Now, in this familiar worship space, the temptation is much more subtle, to let praise matter a little bit too much, to let the people's words entice him away from his commitment to God's mission. Jesus pushes back against this temptation, refusing to be intoxicated by their praise, because his sermon isn't over yet. He's got some truth to tell that these people don't want to hear. So he pushes forward with these stories of ancient prophets and faithful foreigners, the widow at Zarephath and Naaman the Syrian. The Nazareth congregation needs to hear that no community, not even his own hometown, has special access to God's grace, that the love of God is meant for everyone. And that assertion is so inflammatory that in 5 short verses, the congregation turns from praise into rage. Rage is a serious word. On the anger continuum, we could say there's displeasure and irritation on one side. In the middle, there's, we've got to talk about this right now, upsetness. And on the far other end is rage. Rage is a kind of all-consuming fury, overwhelming, that feels like we can't even think straight. There was an article on NPR this week on the subject of anger and the ways that diverse cultures talk about it. In India, there's a fantastically vivid word for a particular kind of anger, and the translation is when eggplant hits hot oil. So it's when you hear something and you are suddenly furious, something you really, really dislike or intensely upsets you. And here in the synagogue, eggplant hits hot oil, and this rage morphs the congregation from one that's praising him into a murderous mob. They drive Jesus out of the synagogue, run him out of town to the edge of this precipice where they're about to throw him off. It's an unbelievable switch and an eerie glimpse ahead to how things will end for Jesus, to the change that will take place between the Palm Sunday crowds shouting out Hosanna, to the Good Friday mob calling out Crucify. That Good Friday rage starts right here at the beginning of his ministry, in his own hometown, where Jesus is already offending people with truth they don't want to hear. There's some people in the world who seem to have the gift of not really caring what other people think, but for many of us, it's a constant battle. It's incredibly tempting to focus our attention on trying to please other people. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with praise, it has a dangerous edge. It feels good to hear good things about ourselves. We may start to crave that positive attention so much that we start making decisions based on what we think other people will like. That's certainly true for pastors, who tend to thrive on the appreciation of their congregations. It's true in dating, when we fear that the other person won't be attracted to who we really are. That's true for parents, when we want just a little too much for our children to like us. It's true for politicians, when they make decisions based on what's going to get them reelected. It's true in Hollywood, when profit drives decisions to portray graphic violence and sexuality. And it's true in our work, when we set our boss's approval as our highest aim. In each of these temptations, we're being enticed to put the praise of other people ahead of things like integrity and honesty. But while we may know that this is a problem, it is easy to be intoxicated by the appeal of approval. Praise feels good, and criticism can easily touch a nerve. And yet criticism is not always a sign that we are doing something wrong. The prophets of ancient Israel were widely criticized for their faith, as were the early Christians. What Jesus experienced in the synagogue was not unique. People who came before him faced it, and so did many people after him. And so as Professor Walton proclaimed last year to a room full of pastors and other church leaders, we need to be careful not to get high on the contact smoke of praise. True praise and validation have got to be rooted in the quiet voice of God, the stirring of the Spirit in our conscience and our own quest to be faithful servants of the Lord. When we face criticism, we've got to ask, who am I seeking to please? Am I striving to win the approval of another person or the approval of the Lord? Is this criticism a genuine critique that I need to hear, or is it a temptation to draw back from my own commitment to Jesus Christ? 200 years ago, a man named Elijah Parrish Lovejoy must have wrestled with these same questions. Lovejoy was a Presbyterian minister and journalist, and in 1827, the year before our Covington congregation was founded, Lovejoy became editor of the St. Louis Observer, a Presbyterian weekly in which he began to write strong condemnations of slavery. Missouri was a slave state, and many important men publicly requested that he tone down his calls for emancipation. Lovejoy replied by reasserting his belief in the freedom of speech. Threats of attack led him to move his press across the river into the free state of Illinois, but the mobs followed him there. His press was destroyed by violence several times, And finally, in 1837, at the age of 34, a mob attacked the building once again, housing his press, and Lovejoy was killed in its defense. He was later buried in an unmarked grave. And yet his death did not deter that movement. Just the opposite, in fact, stirring up the passions of those opposed to slavery, strengthening the abolitionist sentiment in our country. 20 years later, Abraham Lincoln wrote, "Lovejoy's tragic death for freedom, in every sense, marked his sad ending as the most important single event that ever happened in the New World." The opposition, the murderous rage of the crowd at Lovejoy's press couldn't crush the movement of God's Spirit. In fact, it fanned the flames of passion in moving our nation forward toward justice. That opposition was painful. It was destructive, but it couldn't get in the way of God. Mindful of these two stories, the response to Jesus in Nazareth and the opposition faced by Reverend Lovejoy, I want to challenge you today, in the words of Professor Walton, to have a healthy suspicion of praise. For we follow this one named Jesus, whose preaching and teaching repeatedly challenged the culture of his day, upsetting assumptions, even among the people who once knew him best. As Christians, we follow him, not trying to provoke unnecessary conflict, but also not letting ourselves be swayed from faith and discipleship when we face opposition. So I invite you then to consider, what has the power to sustain your soul? Praise from other people leads to a quick high, but a long-lasting low, jostling our sense of self-worth on the roller coaster of rejection. But the voice of God is steady, wise, and clear, loving, affirming, and correcting us, always drawing us nearer and nearer to the heart of God, inviting us to seek first of all to follow in the way of Jesus Christ and find soul-sustaining power in our God. Amen.